I'm Professor Jennifer Tellerico at Lafayette College from the Department of Psychology, and I am going to talk today about the topic of flashbulb memories. So flashbulb memories are probably a phenomenon that you're familiar with. It's this idea of knowing exactly where you were and what you were doing when you learned about an important public event. So this Gary Larson comic here hopefully captures this phenomenon quite well. The idea that everybody in the forest knows exactly where they were and what they were doing when Bambi's mother was shot. More real life examples, tragically, they're also about sad, upsetting events, things like knowing where you were when you heard about the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the US or the 7/7 terrorist attacks in the UK, other kinds of natural disasters, political events, etc. And so the way we define flashbulb memories in the literature is by asking participants to, do you recall the circumstances in which you first heard that this event occurred? So this phrasing comes to us from Roger Brown here in the bottom corner. And so he and his colleague Kulik did this in the late 60s, early 70s, asking participants about a series of events in the US that occurred during that decade. Asking, do you recall where the circumstances in which you first heard that President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated, that his brother Robert F. Kennedy had been assassinated, that Martin Luther King had been assassinated, that Malcolm X had been assassinated. Not a pleasant time in our history. And basically, by asking participants about their personal circumstances during these public events, what Brown and Kulik found was that everybody, all of their participants, regardless of their background, reported at least one memory, or a memory for at least one of these events, that was accurate, that was complete, that was vivid. And remember, they're asking these questions of participants a number of years later, right? Almost 10, 12 years later, depending on the particular event. And so the question is, well, why is that important? Well, that's important because we know from a variety of evidence, even your own lived experience, that normal everyday memory is fallible, right? If you've ever had an argument with a sibling or a spouse about what happened at a particular time and place, you might have disagreed about the details of that event. And so either you or they might have believed the memory to be inaccurate or at least incomplete. There might be certain memories that you remember with a lot of vividness, a lot of detail, and others that are less clear. You just have a vague or uncertain sense of what happened. And so if we get that kind of variability in our normal everyday autobiographical memory, if we have memories that are not like that, that seem to be much more enhanced, right, then that becomes a phenomenon of interest to cognitive psychologists, social psychologists, anybody who's interested in how and why people remember events in the world. In fact, one of the quotes from the Brown and Kulik paper that I mentioned earlier is, what else can you remember from 1963? So they're writing this 10, 12, 15 years later, and it's like, well, lots of things happen, and yet I can remember very clearly where I was and what I was doing when I learned that JFK had been assassinated. And I don't have that similar phenomenological experience for other kinds of events from that same year. And so that's what led them to coin the term flashbulb memory, right? It's as if a flash went off in your brain, in your mind, to capture this experience in all of its detail, indiscriminately, right? You're just going to capture everything from the most important from the most mundane. And they actually hypothesized that there was a special memory mechanism, right? They called it the now print mechanism, right? There was a hypothesized biological mechanism for how this happened. There was an evolutionary argument for why this was adaptive, right? That in circumstances in which an important emotional event happens, it is to your benefit to capture everything that's going on at the time, such that you can review the details of that experience later to learn from it, right? And so there was this argument that there's a special memory mechanism that acts like a camera, right? It was still a metaphor, it was still an analogy, but there's a mechanism that acts like a camera to record details of events in certain emotional situations, right? And so we can think about the particular properties of events that give rise to memories of this type. They're surprising, they're public, they're emotional, and they're consequential, right? Meaning they're novel, they come out of nowhere. They're public, so they're shared by a large group of individuals. There's an emotional reaction, right? They're effectively salient, and they have consequences in the world, either directly or indirectly. There's some aspects of life that change as a consequence, as a result of that experience, of that event. So those are aspects of the event that predict whether we might have a flashbulb memory. And there's also aspects of the memory that we think differentiate them from, again, normal everyday memories. They're accurate, they're long-lasting, they're vivid, meaning they have a lot of details, and those details have a lot of clarity with them, right? So you can see what was happening, you can hear what was going on, there's a lot of clarity, and just the quantity and quality of those details is enhanced. And we're very confident, right? In that initial example I gave you, there's this phenomenon of knowing exactly where you were and exactly what you were doing, right? Very strongly held beliefs about these recollections. So let me show you a different example of flashbulb memory. So I'll read this. I would recall sitting in the living room of our house. We only lived in that house for 1 year, but I remember it well. I was listening to a baseball game on the radio. The game was interrupted by an announcement of the attack, and I rushed upstairs to tell my mother. So this is Dick Neisser down here, his recollection of learning about the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, if you're a student of history, you should be questioning something about this recollection. So Pearl Harbor Day is December 7th, the day that shall live in infamy. Baseball is not played at that time of year. So here you have a recollection that's very vivid, it's very long lasting, right? So this is being reported in 1988, and yet it can't be accurate, right? Very confident, very vivid, very detailed, very long lasting, can't be accurate. So this struck Neisser as being really interesting, right? Here's a memory he's held with him his whole life, and it wasn't until he was, reading this paper by Brown and Kulick that he began to question his own recollection. So he and his student Nicole Harsh really criticized Brown and Kulick for assuming the accuracy of their reports that their participants provided, right? For taking for granted the fact that these memory reports were so detailed and were so confidently held and were reported at such length that they assumed that the details within them were accurate. Now, just to take a step back, all of our memories need to be sufficiently accurate, right? There wouldn't be an evolutionary adaptation for memory if it didn't have some connection to the past, right? So yes, most of our memories are mostly accurate, but how accurate is accurate enough, right? And what are the inaccuracies? Why did the inaccuracies arise? And what can those inaccuracies tell us about the accurate recall? Those were the kinds of questions that Neisser and Harsh were really interested in, right? And so they really wanted to draw our attention to the fact that just because a memory is vivid does not imply that it's accurate. And just because a memory is confidently held does not imply that it is accurate. So what you really need to do to test the accuracy is to examine someone's memory at 2 points in time and to see if both of those reports are describing the same thing. So that's what they did. We call that a test-retest design. So they asked participants their memory for one of these flashbulb events very soon after the event, right? The day after. And then 2.5 years later, they asked those same participants to report their memory for that same event. Now, importantly, right, they were not with participants at the time of the event, right? So we don't actually know that even the first report is accurate. But what we do know is that if both of those memory reports are telling us the same thing, that's at least a better indicator of accuracy than these measures. And importantly, if those two reports are different, That's telling us that at least one of those reports is inaccurate, right? So an inconsistency must necessarily imply an inaccuracy. And for a lot of reasons having to do with forgetting rates over time, we tend to assume the first report is the one that is more likely to be accurate. And so if there's an inconsistency, we attribute that to an error in the subsequent report. Right? So I've been kind of vague. What was the event that they asked participants about? Was the Challenger explosion. So the Space Shuttle Challenger that exploded upon takeoff that had the first civilian astronaut on board, a school teacher, Krista McCullough. So here are two flashbulb memory reports of that event. I was in religion class and some people walked in and started talking about it. I didn't know any details except that it had exploded and the school teacher's students had all been watching, which I thought was so sad. Then after class, I went to my room and watched the TV program talking about it, and I got all the details from that. Okay? Second report. When I first heard about the explosion, I was sitting in my freshman dorm room with my roommate and we were watching TV. It came on as a news flash and we were both totally shocked. I was really upset and I went upstairs to talk to a friend of mine and then I called my parents. So you can see these kinds of memory reports completely fit our expectation of flashbulb memories, right? They're very detailed, they're very elaborate, there's clarity in the descriptions that are being provided, there's a lot of information about who, what, where, when, right? My actions immediately before and after I learned the news. And so if we were Brown and Kulik, we would assume both of these reports are accurate. But because we're nicer and harsh and we didn't assume that, we did this test-retest design. These two reports are actually from the same participant. The one at the top of the page is their first report the day after the explosion, and the one at the bottom of the page is that same participant's report of where they were and what they were doing when the Challenger exploded, how they first heard that news 2.5 years later. So clearly there are some inconsistencies between these two reports, right? So that's what nicer and harsher plotting here is the accuracy, right? Really the consistency. But they basically coded 7 particular kinds of details. Again, who was there, what the participants were doing, where they were, etc. And the highest possible score you could get was 7, right? So repeating the exact same information at time 1 that you did at time 2, or sorry, the exact same information at time 2 that you had reported at time 1. And a 0 would of course mean that there was no overlap, that you told 2 completely different stories between time 1 and time 2. And obviously what we're seeing here is that there is a gradation. The participants, there were some who were completely accurate and some who were completely inaccurate, and many participants were somewhere in between. Here's where things are really interesting. Here is if you ask participants how confident they were that what they were reporting was exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing, right? How confident are you that what you are reporting is what actually happened? And here we see much less variability. Most participants are at ceiling, right? They gave the highest possible rating. And only very, very few participants even went below the midpoint on that confidence scale. So here are nicer and harsher making a really clear point that accuracy and confidence are not, in fact, correlated, right? That most people are highly confident in their recollection, even though there's lots of inconsistencies here. So if we think about memory errors, right, we can think about errors of omission. That's just forgetting. That's leaving details out, things that you did include initially and then omitted later. We can also think about errors of commission, the introduction of new or changed information, right? Either saying I was wearing a blue shirt and then saying I was wearing a red shirt, or saying I was with Susie and then later saying I was with Susie and Sally, right? So those would be errors of commission. I'm adding or changing details that were not originally included in my report, right? We also sometimes call these false memories, right? And so that becomes the major question within flashbulb memory research is what kinds of errors are we making? Clearly there's a little bit of forgetting, but we're also seeing evidence of these errors of commission. And we need to think about why and what types of errors of commission are we seeing. So one argument is that what we're seeing in these flashbulb memory reports are what's called a wrong time slice. right? So if you think about, our lived experience is a continual stream of events, right? And so the participant might be describing something that actually happened, but it's not the right thing that you asked them to tell you about. So in a flashbulb context, we ask people, how did you first learn this news? And so if you tell me about the third time you learned the news, it's not really what I'm asking you for. In the same way, if I ask you how you celebrated your 20th birthday and you tell me about your 18th birthday party, you've made a mistake, right? Yes, that's a real event, but there is something importantly different about you confusing your 18th for your 20th birthday or vice versa. And the same is true here. So if we think back to those two reports of the Challenger explosion, right, the first report just said, oh, I was in class and I didn't really learn much, and then I went back to my dorm room and that's when I learned the details from the news. The second report said I was in my dorm room at the time and it came on as a news flash and I was shocked and then I called my parents. It might be the case that what actually happened for this participant is that they were in class, didn't really make an impression, they got back to their room. That's when the true gravity of the situation hit home, and that's when they did all of the things that they described in both events. But after time, they forget the first time, right? They forget about having heard that in their class, and they only remember having watched it on the news. And so they misremember the second time they heard the news as if it were the first time, right? That's an important error. And in fact, there is a predictability to the kinds of slices we are more likely to remember and less likely to remember. So in this particular case, it's true that people were more likely to misremember having seen it on the news than they were to make the mistake in the opposite direction. Meaning they were less likely to say they saw it at the news originally and then later say they heard it from a person than they were to originally say they heard it from a person and then later say they saw it on the news. And so one of the reasons one of the ways in which we might explain that is that, for this particular event, there was graphic visual footage of the explosion occurring and of the sort of smoke in the sky, right? That's a vivid, visceral, visual image that we know images are more durable, right? We remember images better than we do just text-based information. So hearing it from a person is likely less memorable than seeing a visual. And so that's important, right? That tells us that these flashbulb memories are operating in the same way that normal, everyday autobiographical and episodic memories actually operate, that we see a picture salience effect here in the same way that we do there, right? So this idea of making a source error, right, of incorrectly believing that the TV was the initial source is, again, completely consistent with what we know about source memory errors in other kinds of contexts. We know that in other kinds of autobiographical laboratory studies, participants can confuse imaginary events, things that they just imagined might have occurred. Later, they sometimes believe those events actually did occur, right? And so this confusion for what we thought we did versus what we actually did, confusing vivid visual images as being more salient, being more durable, maybe being given primacy versus subsequent, less detailed, less vivid sources, right? Show us that these errors are systematic and they are predictable based on everyday autobiographical experience. There's also some things that don't really have to do with memory per se, but have to do with how we tell stories about our social interactions with one another. So you can kind of put these under the heading of poetic license. That often what's happening is, again, it's not necessarily that people are inventing details, though that might be happening. But what's probably occurring is they are merging details from subsequent episodes of learning about this event into one overarching story, right? To make it a better story, something that is more entertaining. And so we know that these kinds of events are rehearsed frequently within social groups. If this is an event that is important to your group, to your country, to your community, whatever that social group is, if you have people with whom you can talk about this event, you are likely to talk about it. Where were you when you learned about 9/11? Oh, I was here, and this is what my story. What was yours, right? In this social sharing, right? We know, again, from memory studies out inside and outside the laboratory, that rehearsal improves memory. That the more you repeat something, the more durable, the longer lasting that detail is, regardless of whether that detail actually happened or not, right? So rehearsal can improve the durability of both true and false details, right? And does seem to be the case that basically these inconsistencies that are introduced to flashbulb memories, there's a period of instability when these details are introduced, and then a period of stability where people do tend to repeat these well-rehearsed stories over and over. And again, that is true whether those stories themselves are primarily accurate or primarily inaccurate. Right? So these kinds of pieces of evidence led Neisser and Harsh to conclude that, quote, flashbulb memories may be appreciably less reliable than other cases of vivid and confident recall. So our pendulum has swung all the way to the other side, right? Brown and Kulik were saying, hey, flashbulb memories are a special, extraordinary phenomenon that are, really accurate and really vivid and really long-lasting, right? They're extraordinarily good memories. And now Neisser and Harsh are saying the opposite, that because of all of these social factors, all of these influences that we know are capable of introducing error, all of these are present in a flashbulb memory context, that perhaps flashbulb memories are less likely to be accurate, are more unreliable than everyday memories. So two diametrically opposed interpretations of this same phenomenon. So that's where we are at this point in the discipline, right? Struggling with this idea of, are flashbulb memories accurate or inaccurate, right? Both sides will acknowledge that either of these is a strong man, right? Neither side is truly claiming that flashbulb memories are perfectly accurate or completely inaccurate, right? But it's a matter of degree. It's a matter of emphasis. Are they primarily accurate or are they primarily inaccurate? And both of these claims have an implicit comparison with normal everyday autobiographical memory. But importantly, that comparison is implicit. Neither of these investigators, right, actually tested everyday autobiographical memories from approximately the same time as the flashbulb event. So that's what we would really need, is a control condition, right, a control memory within a test-retest design in order to sort of address this question more fully. So that's what my colleague, David Rubin, there in the top right, and I did in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. So in 2001, right, on September 11th, New York and Washington, D.C. were attacked. There was a crash in Pennsylvania as well, a Florida attack. And so we asked our participants the canonical question, right, what were the circumstances in which you learned about the 9/11 attacks? But importantly, we also asked them, hey, tell me something else, the most memorable event from the preceding weekend. So 9/11 was a Tuesday. We tested participants on Wednesday. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So we asked participants to identify a candidate everyday autobiographical event from the preceding weekend. So the study was done at Duke. So we've got our 9/11 memory and we've got our everyday memory from about the same time period. Now, as I said, we were really fortunate. It turns out the IRB was actually meeting on September 11th. So as these events were unfolding, they were in a closed meeting approving ethics protocols for human subjects research. So as I was frantically putting together materials, David interrupted the IRB meeting to present our design and our materials to get expedited approval for us to conduct this study, such that on September 12th, 2001, we were able to collect memory reports from a group of 54 Duke students and to ask them, again, Tell me about how you first learned about the 9/11 attacks, and tell me about a memorable event from the preceding weekend, and give that event a title. So the soccer game versus UNC, or Joe's birthday party, whatever the case may be. Then, importantly, right, we're still going to use a two-test retest design, but we broke that group of 54 into 3 smaller groups of 18, so that each participant was only asked to report their memory twice, once the day after and once at one subsequent delay interval. So one group was asked a week later, one group was asked about a month later, and one group was asked about 6 months later. So again, each participant only provided 2 memory reports, and the delay interval between those reports differed as a function of the group to which you were assigned. And we did that primarily because we know that autobiographical memories tend to decline on a logarithmic scale. So that's why we chose our 1 week, 1 month, 6 months sort of time periods. There's a little bit of variability there depending on just the academic schedule and when we could get our participants back into the lab again. But basically what we're trying to assess is what is the time course of forgetting for both the everyday memory and the flashbulb memory. And remember, we're going to look not just at forgetting at errors of omission, but we're also going to look at these errors of commission, right? What kinds of mistakes are people making where they are introducing new details or changing details from time 1 to time 2? And so if Brown and Kulik are sort of right, this sort of Roger Brown sort of pro-flashbulb memory hypothesis, what we would expect to see is if we look at the flashbulb memory, right, in the dark line and the everyday memory in the dashed line, if we look at the consistency of details, the repetition of the same information over time, right, again, Brown and they're going to acknowledge that there might be some forgetting initially, but that at least for the flashbulb memory, that forgetting should level up, and we should see stable, enhanced memory for those details. Whereas the everyday memory will decrease on that logarithmic scale the same way that we've known since Ebbinghaus memories sort of forget over time. In terms of the introduction of errors, again, maybe we'll see some of that for the flashbulb memory, but certainly much less than we will for the everyday memories, right? We know that everyday autobiographical memories include some of these inconsistencies, but if the pro-flashbulb memory hypothesis is true, flashbulb memories will be better in terms of less forgetting and fewer intrusions. If, on the other hand, Neisser is right, and this sort of anti-flashbulb memory hypothesis, we're going to see that pattern reverse. And here, the flashbulb memories, remember, are going to be less consistent over time, include more errors because of those processes that they identified. And so the everyday memory should sort of balance out, right? Should include some, but very few overall errors, but that the flashbulb memory, because of these social factors, because of vividness and emotionality, all of those should make them appreciably less reliable. And of course, our third possible outcome is the null hypothesis, right? That there's no difference between flashbulb and everyday memories. That flashbulb memories are just another category of autobiographical memory that are neither better nor worse than we would expect an everyday autobiographical experience to be. So again, we're seeing the flashbulb and the everyday lines parallel. Both forgetting and intrusions should be the same. So what did we actually find? Well, you tell me. I've argued this graph looks remarkably like that third graph I just showed you. There's no appreciable difference between the flashbulb and the everyday memory, either in terms of the loss of information, the omission of details, or in the intrusion of information, the addition of inconsistent or of novel details over time, right? The flashbulb memory of September 11th and their memory of Joe's birthday party or that UNC soccer game, whatever the case may be, right? That both of those memories are equally consistent or inconsistent. right? Both sides of that coin seem to be operating similarly. But again, much like Neisser and Harsh found, we do see some differences between the flashbulb and the everyday memory. Not in terms of those objective characteristics, but in terms of the subjective characteristics. So again, after a week, you're still pretty confident that you are remembering Joe's birthday party or that soccer game really well, right? But by a month or 6 months later, you're willing to admit, yeah, I'm probably forgetting some stuff. I'm maybe not remembering that event as well as I think I am. But we are unwilling to admit that kind of error, that kind of loss for the flashbulb memory. We remain very confident in our flashbulb memory. That's the key phenomenon here, we've argued, is that it's this sense of, I know exactly where I was and exactly what I was doing. It's that confidence in the memory that seems to differentiate flashbulb memories from everyday memories. And it also seems to be that confidence is based on some sort of increased quantity and quality of the details that are being remembered, right? So there's more information, and the clarity of that information, right? I know exactly where I was. I can see the spatial layout. I can see the faces of the people involved and what they were wearing, right? I feel like I have more and more vivid information about that memory. Again, over a long time period. Whereas the everyday memory loses that vividness over time, right? So hopefully now I sort of showed you that there is something special about flashbulb memories, but it's not maybe what we originally thought made them special. That the memory sort of content doesn't seem to be appreciably different between flashbulb memories and autobiographical memories, but our subjective interpretation or our feelings about those memories do seem to be different. And so if that is what we need to explain, we still have some explaining to do. So why do we have flashbulb memories? Why do we have these highly confident, highly vivid memories of distant public events, of what we were doing when that event occurred? And so if we go back to that original Brown and Kulik study, so I told you they asked about a variety of events from the 60s, mostly political events, many assassinations. And it was the case that all of their participants had at least one memory that was highly detailed and accurate. But it was also the case that there was variability in the particular events that their participants had those types of memories for. So if we look at Black and white Americans, all participants seem to have, or almost all Americans, seem to have a flashbulb memory for the assassination of the president. But if we look at other events, particularly events that were salient within the African-American community, within the Black community, because these were actors who were very prominent within the civil rights movement at that time and their particular assassinations, it was the case that there were some white Americans who had a flashbulb memory of learning that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. But there were far fewer white Americans than Black Americans. And that same pattern is true for the assassination of Malcolm X and of Medgar Evers. In fact, for Medgar Evers, only Black Americans had flashbulb memories for that event. So there's something here about that consequentiality piece, right? There's an argument to be made that the assassinations of these leaders had more consequences for the members of the community for whom civil rights was a more personal, a more socially relevant issue, Black Americans, than for white Americans. And so within those communities, right, there were more opportunities for rehearsal, right? That Black Americans were more likely to talk with other Black Americans about these events, to talk about their experience of these events, and to elaborate these memories. And so it's that elaboration process that leads to these vivid and complete memories that then are long-lasting, that are durable, and that are confidently held. And so there does seem to be something really important about not just your individual memory, but the relationship between your individual memory and your larger social group. Again, it's important that these be public events. events that occur to a large group of people, right? Or that are known to a large group of people. And so then it becomes, to whom are those events emotional, vivid, consequential, right? And so that's really one of the primary contributions of Jordan Bernson, pictured here, who really argued that it is these social factors that determine the consequentiality of an event, right? That first, to make an event sort of even show up on your radar, to be newsworthy, it has to be relevant to your social group, right? This is why domestic political events are always more salient than international political events, right? The things that are local are more important, right, than things that are more remote. So first, we have to recognize that something is important to us, however us is defined, whether it be nationally or ethnically or racially or by gender or by age or by even by our sports team affiliation, right? Any kind of social group. First, it has to be happening to us. If it's happening to us, I'm going to have an emotional reaction to it. Right? I might be really happy if my sports team wins. I might be really sad if my sports team loses. I might be shocked if there's a natural disaster or a terrorist event, right? I'm going to have that emotional reaction because I believe or identify that with happening to my group. Because it's happening within my group, I have a group of people with whom to rehearse that event. I'm shocked, you're shocked, we talk about our shock together, right? So I have talking about it, public rehearsal. I'm also more likely to ruminate, to think about, to privately rehearse that event because it was emotional, right? Because it's important to me. And if these processes occur, we know that they are likely to result in memories that are long lasting, that are vivid, that are detailed, and that are relatively accurate, but are going to contain inaccuracies, and they're going to contain inaccuracies that are result from these kinds of processes. The other thing that Jordan Bernson really added to this conversation that I think is really important is the idea that having the flashbulb memory is a sort of feedback loop, that it becomes proof of your membership of that social group, right? So I would be a poor patriot if I, as an American of a certain age, did not remember where I was and what I was doing when 9/11 happened, right? I happen to be doing flashbulb memory research, but that's neither here nor there, right? If I, as a fan of my sports team, can't tell you my memory of our championship win, I'm not really a fan, right? But if I have that memory, that shared experience, that's proof of my membership, and I can use that to enhance my social bonds within that group, right? And so it turns out that, again, the errors that do occur, right? So we know that flashbulb memories contain inaccuracies, but it turns out that those inaccuracies either enhance the image of our social group, right? It's about resilience, it's about positive characteristics, right? We rehearse, right, wins of our team or times when we were robbed, right? Things that enhance the image of our social group, or aspects of the memory that enhance our identification with that social group. So again, my proof of membership is having detailed, elaborate, vivid recollection of that event. Right? So again, Dorda has done some work about misremembering, say, the invasion of Denmark during World War II as being a rainier, cloudier, colder, more miserable day, and the day of the liberation of Denmark in World War I as being sunnier and warmer and clearer. And so we see the mistakes in misremembering the weather are biased in the direction of the emotionality attributed to those events, right? So again, most people remember the weather relatively accurate, but if I'm going to make a mistake, it's going to be in the direction that enhances the image of my group, is consistent with my emotional interpretation, or enhances my identification with that group, right? Those rehearsal processes are really, really important, right? Remember, rehearsal enhances recall of all details. And it's the elaboration, the sort of quantity of details that lead to that subjective feeling of vividness. And both inaccurate and accurate details contribute to that phenomenology, right? So if I take some poetic license, consciously or unconsciously, to elaborate my story, right? And maybe I'm introducing some error, but those errors are going to increase my vividness and increase my confidence, right, in that recollection. It's going to increase the durability, my confidence, all of those attributions, right? So it's that increased vividness that enhances all of those subjective beliefs, right? Particularly confidence, but all sorts of other attributions about my memory for that event, right? So hopefully you have a slightly more nuanced understanding of flashbulb memories now and can take that with you and evaluate either events that occur that might lead to flashbulb memories or the memories that result from those kinds of events in the future. My contact information is there. Thanks so much. Bye.